A ruthless gang member thought a royal guard was just another man in a uniform, an easy target. But the moment he lunged with a knife, he learned the hard way that ceremony hides a soldier. Here's how it all unfolded. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Guard Henry Lancaster maintained his post, his bearing perfect despite the tension building in the air. 8 years of military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, had taught him to recognize the signs of impending violence. Right now, every instinct, honed in combat, was screaming a warning. Rico Bennett moved through the crowd like a shark through shallow water, his predatory gaze fixed on the guard's ceremonial position. The nickname wasn't just for show. 3 assault convictions and a reputation for knife work had earned him that title in London's underground. His weathered leather jacket, despite the warm weather, concealed more than just his gang tattoos. "Look at this one," Rico muttered to no one in particular, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who'd spent more time in fights than conversation. "Standing there like a proper target, ain't he?" His fingers twitched inside his jacket pocket, caressing the switchblade that had become as familiar as a second heartbeat. 2 young mothers hurriedly guided their children away, something primal warning them about the man whose cold eyes never left the guard's position. A street vendor selling Union Jack souvenirs quietly packed up his most valuable merchandise, recognition of trouble born from years working London's tourist spots. Guard Lancaster remained motionless, but his mind was active. 8 years of service had taught him to observe while appearing oblivious. He noted Rico's stance, the slight favour to his right side, suggesting a weapon. The practiced way he scanned for cameras and security, the subtle nods to 3 other men who'd taken positions around the perimeter of the tourist area. "Reckon he bleeds red like the rest of us." Rico's voice carried just enough to reach nearby tourists, causing several to step back. His accent was pure East End, but there was something else in it. The kind of bitterness that comes from a lifetime of feeling powerless and finally finding a way to hurt back. The guard's ceremonial rifle remained perfectly positioned, its weight familiar after countless hours of duty. But Lancaster's mind was on the combat knife strapped to his leg, hidden beneath the ceremonial uniform. Not that he'd need it. CQC training had taught him 17 ways to disarm a knife-wielding attacker without drawing a weapon. "These guards," Rico continued, moving closer with the deliberate pace of someone setting up an attack, "think they're something special, don't they? All done up in their fancy dress." His boots scuffed against the pavement as he began circling Lancaster's position, staying just outside the prescribed boundary. "But underneath all that red and gold, they're just men, just meat and bone like the rest of us." A group of American tourists backed away, their cameras lowered, sensing this wasn't the kind of London attraction they'd come to photograph. An elderly gentleman wearing a veteran's pin touched his wife's arm, guiding her toward the palace gates while keeping one eye on the unfolding scene. Lancaster had seen Rico's type before, in back alleys in Helmand Province, in crowded markets where danger lurked behind smiles, in the moments before violence erupted from seeming calm. His ceremonial uniform might look ornamental to tourists, but underneath was a combat veteran who'd earned his position through more than just parade ground practice. "You know what I think?" Rico was closer now, his voice dropping to a tone Lancaster recognized from his combat days. The quiet that comes before an explosion. "I think it's time someone showed everyone here what's under all that ceremony. Time to remind everyone that fancy uniforms don't stop a blade." The sun had shifted, casting Rico's shadow across the courtyard stones. Behind him, his 3 associates had begun moving through the crowd, their movements casual but purposeful. Tourist photos had stopped entirely now, replaced by nervous glances and hurried departures. Lancaster's eyes remained forward, his posture perfect, but every muscle was prepared. Years of combat experience had taught him that real violence doesn't announce itself with dramatic speeches. It explodes from moments just like this, when tension builds to a breaking point and someone decides to make the first move. "Come on, soldier boy!" Rico circled closer, his voice taking on the edge of someone testing boundaries before shattering them completely. "Let's see what you've got under all that fancy dress." His hand remained inside his jacket, the outline of something metallic occasionally visible through the worn leather. The three other gang members had taken strategic positions, one near the palace gates, two others blending with the thinning crowd. Their practiced movements spoke of previous coordinated attacks, of violence planned and executed with street-smart precision. "You see," Rico continued, close enough now that Lancaster could smell the cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. "People like you, standing here playing statue, you're everything that's wrong with this city." His boots scraped against the pavement as he deliberately crossed the boundary line tourists knew to respect. All this ceremony, all this tradition, just ways to keep people like me in our place in it. Lancaster's peripheral vision caught one of Rico's associates palming something that glinted in the fading light. Brass knuckles, probably, given the way he was flexing his fingers. The other two had spread out further, creating a loose triangle with Rico at its point. Classic street tactics, designed to control the space and prevent escape. "But here's the thing about places," Rico's voice dropped lower, meant now only for Lancaster's ears. "They can change real quick when enough blood gets spilled on the stones." He moved even closer, his shoulder almost brushing Lancaster's ceremonial rifle. "Wonder what colour these fancy stones turn when royal guards start bleeding on them." A young couple who'd been taking photos nearby finally gave up any pretense of sightseeing, hurrying away as Rico's associates began subtly herding remaining tourists from the area. The clearing space around Lancaster's post felt like a combat zone being prepared for an ambush, something he'd experienced too many times in Afghanistan to mistake. "You lot think you're special, don't you?" Rico was practically whispering now, his face inches from Lancaster's bearskin cap. "Standing here, day after day, looking down on people like me." His free hand gestured at his gang members. "But we're done being looked down on. Done being treated like we don't belong in our own city." Lancaster remained motionless, but his combat-trained senses were cataloguing every detail. The way Rico shifted his weight suggested the knife was in his right pocket. The positions of his associates indicated they'd done this before, probably targeting other uniformed personnel. The gradual clearing of civilians from the area meant they'd planned this, chosen their moment carefully. "Know what we did to the last uniform who thought he was better than us?" Rico's voice carried a hint of pride now, mixed with something darker. "Found him behind his station house, didn't we? All that authority didn't help him much when—" "Sir," a palace security officer called from a safe distance, finally noticing the situation. "Step back from the guard." His hand was already moving toward his radio, but he maintained his distance, standard procedure when dealing with potentially armed suspects. Rico's laugh was ugly, carrying the promise of violence. "Or what? You'll call for backup." He turned his head slightly, addressing the security officer while staying close to Lancaster. "By the time they get here, your fancy guard will be showing everyone exactly how human he really is." The officer's radio crackled with coded responses, palace security mobilizing, Metropolitan Police being notified. But Lancaster knew from experience that response times, even at Buckingham Palace, meant at least 2 minutes before armed backup could arrive. A lot could happen in 2 minutes. "Last chance," Rico's voice dropped to a whisper again. "Drop the rifle, take off that stupid hat, and walk away. Otherwise—" His hand shifted inside his jacket, metal catching the light. "Otherwise, we're about to make headlines, you and me." Lancaster's eyes remained forward, his posture parade ground perfect, but his mind was in combat mode. He noted the positions of all four attackers, calculated angles and distances, prepared for the violence that was certainly coming. His ceremonial uniform might look ornamental, but underneath was a soldier who'd earned his stripes in real combat. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. In the distance, sirens began to wail, Metropolitan Police responding to the palace security alert. But Lancaster knew they wouldn't arrive in time. The tension in Rico's stance, the positions of his associates, the way his hand gripped something in his pocket, all signs pointed to imminent action. "Time's up, soldier boy." Rico's voice had lost all pretense of conversation. "Let's see what's really under all that ceremony." His boots shifted against the pavement, muscles tensing for what was about to come. What happened next unfolded like a combat photographer's slow-motion sequence. Each frame burned into the memories of stunned onlookers. Rico's hand emerged from his jacket with practiced speed, tendons standing out on his neck as he committed to the attack. The switchblade, a custom piece with a blackened 6-inch blade, caught the fading sunlight as it snapped open. The sound of its release mechanism echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard like a death knell. Rico's lunge was textbook street fighting, low, fast, aimed at the vulnerable gap between Lancaster's ceremonial tunic and collar. The blade's trajectory would have opened the guard's throat in one savage slash, a killing stroke born from too many back-alley fights. But while Rico had learned his craft in London's darkest corners, Lancaster had honed his skills in the crucible of actual combat. 8 years of military service, countless close-quarters combat drills, and the razor-sharp muscle memory forged in Afghanistan's kill-or-die moments don't vanish under ceremonial red wool. The rifle's movement was a masterpiece of economic violence. Lancaster pivoted exactly 3 inches, the minimum distance needed, while the ceremonial weapon swung in a precise 45-degree arc. The wooden stock, polished to parade ground perfection that morning, became an impact weapon with surgical accuracy. It caught Rico's knife wrist at exactly the point where radius meets carpal, producing a crack that echoed off the palace walls like a starter's pistol. The knife's clatter against the courtyard stones was almost musical, a metallic counterpoint to Rico's grunt of pain and surprise. His sneer of anticipated victory transformed into something else entirely as he staggered back, cradling his injured wrist. The realization dawned in his eyes. He'd made a fundamental miscalculation about what stood before him. But Lancaster wasn't finished. His body flowed from the wrist strike into forward momentum, each movement speaking of thousands of combat drills, performed until they became pure instinct. The ceremonial rifle, no longer just for show, came up to high guard position. The same weapon tourists photographed all day had become what it truly was, a combat tool in trained hands. "You shouldn't have done that," Rico snarled through clenched teeth, his street fighter's pride overriding the pain signals his wrist was sending. He gestured to his associates with his good hand, the movement sharp with wounded fury. "Now you'll wish you'd just taken the blade." The first associate's charge was pure street violence, all aggression and no finesse. His brass knuckles caught the light as he came in from Lancaster's left, clearly expecting to overwhelm ceremonial training with brute force. It was the last mistake he'd make in this fight. Lancaster's pivot was something they taught in advanced close-quarters combat, a fluid rotation that presented the smallest possible target while maximizing strike power. The rifle's stock, already proven as an impact weapon, drove into the attacker's solar plexus with mathematical precision. The strike hit the vagus nerve cluster exactly, producing the distinctive sound of all air explosively leaving human lungs. The man folded like a puppet with cut strings, brass knuckles clattering uselessly beside him. Rico, displaying the desperate tenacity of a cornered predator, had snatched his fallen blade from the stones. The knife's edge caught the dying sunlight as he adjusted his grip, his movements betraying years of street fighting experience. "Get him!" he barked at his remaining associates, fury and wounded pride dripping from every syllable. The two men moved with the coordinated precision of pack hunters, approaching from opposite sides. Their footwork showed familiar patterns. Clearly they'd done this before. Overwhelming lone targets with synchronized attacks. One carried a length of chain, partially concealed in his sleeve, the other flexing hands marked with prison tattoos. Lancaster's response was pure military efficiency. The rifle, despite its ceremonial appearance, became a staff in his trained hands. A quick sweep took the legs out from under one attacker, while the butt caught the other under the chin, sending him sprawling. Years of combat drills and real-world experience had taught him to handle multiple opponents. The ceremonial aspect of his duty hadn't dulled those skills one bit. "Just you and me now, soldier boy," Rico spat, blood from his split lip painting his teeth crimson. The knife in his hand moved in small, practiced arcs, the movements of someone who'd opened flesh before and was eager to do it again. "Let's see how you do without your fancy stick." The rifle had been knocked away in the scuffle. Lancaster's white gloves, pristine moments ago, were now marked with the dirt of combat. But his stance had shifted from ceremonial to pure military. Feet planted, hands ready, eyes locked on his opponent with sniper's focus. Rico struck first, blade slashing in practiced patterns designed to open flesh. But he was used to street fights and bar brawls, not military combat. Lancaster stepped inside the arc of the blade, his movement economical and precise. One white-gloved hand caught Rico's knife wrist, the other delivered a precise strike to the nerve cluster in his elbow. The knife fell again, but Rico wasn't finished. He drove his forehead toward Lancaster's face in a savage headbutt. The guard shifted just enough to take the impact on his shoulder, using Rico's momentum to throw him off balance. "Stay down," Lancaster spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "The Royal Military Police are almost here." But Rico, like many street fighters, didn't know when he was beaten. He scrambled back to his feet, reaching for a second blade concealed in his boot. "I'm going to cut that uniform off you piece by piece," he growled. "Show everyone what's really underneath." The blade had barely cleared his boot when Lancaster moved. 2 quick steps closed the distance. His first strike targeted Rico's knife hand, breaking 2 fingers with mechanical efficiency. The second was an open palm strike to the sternum that sent Rico staggering back. Before Rico could recover, Lancaster had him in a joint lock that spoke of years of hand-to-hand combat training. One hand controlled Rico's damaged knife hand, the other positioned at his throat with precise pressure. 8 years Royal Marines. Lancaster's voice was still calm, still controlled. 2 tours in Afghanistan. The uniform isn't what you should have worried about. He increased the pressure slightly, causing Rico to gasp. "It's what's underneath that you didn't account for." Rico tried to break free, but Lancaster's grip was combat-forged and parade ground precise. Every attempt to escape was met with calculated pressure that sent shocks of pain through his already injured hand. "The thing about ceremony," Lancaster continued, his voice carrying to the stunned onlookers, "is that it's built on substance. Every guard standing watch here has earned their position through real service, real combat, real sacrifice." Armed police were flooding the courtyard now, their weapons trained on Rico's fallen associates. But Lancaster maintained his hold, controlled and professional, until the tactical team reached him. "On your knees," Lancaster commanded, applying precise pressure that gave Rico no choice but to comply. As police moved in with handcuffs, the guard finally released his hold, stepping back with military precision. Rico, defiant to the end, spat blood on the courtyard stones. "You got lucky, soldier boy. Next time..." There won't be a next time, Lancaster cut him off, his voice carrying the weight of combat experience. You made a fundamental mistake. You saw the ceremony and forgot about the soldier. In the meantime, armed police officers swarmed the courtyard, their tactical gear a stark contrast to Lancaster's ceremonial uniform. Rico struggled against the handcuffs, his broken fingers already swelling, face contorted with a mixture of pain and rage. "You're all the same," he spat as officers hauled him to his feet. "Hide behind your uniforms, your laws, your precious ceremony. But I got close enough to see what you really are." His eyes burned with unrepentant hatred as he glared at Lancaster. "Next time, it won't just be me. There's more of us out there, more who are tired of your kind looking down on us." Lancaster had resumed his post, his bearing perfect once more. Only the marks on his white gloves and a slight disarray of his ceremonial sash betrayed the violence that had erupted moments before. His eyes were fixed forward again, but his combat-trained senses remained alert for any further threats. "Multiple concealed weapons," one officer reported, holding up Rico's boot knife in an evidence bag. "Looks like they were planning this for a while. Found communication devices on all 4 of them." Rico's associates were being loaded into separate police vans, their injuries testament to Lancaster's efficient combat skills. One was still wheezing from the rifle strike to his solar plexus, another spitting blood from where the rifle butt had connected with his jaw. "You should have stayed in Afghanistan," Rico shouted as officers began moving him toward a waiting vehicle. "At least there you knew who your enemies were. Here, we're everywhere, every street corner, every alley. Your uniform won't protect you forever." Detective Inspector Williams approached Lancaster's position, warrant card already displayed. "We'll need a statement, obviously," he said, professional but with an underlying respect. "But it can wait until your shift ends. Those 4 have been on our radar for weeks, suspected in 3 other attacks on uniformed personnel." Lancaster gave a barely perceptible nod, maintaining his ceremonial pose. His service in Afghanistan had taught him that some enemies don't wear uniforms, don't follow rules of engagement. The streets of London weren't so different sometimes. "You're dead, you hear me?" Rico was still shouting as officers pushed him into the van. "You and all your kind, playing soldier while the rest of us—" The van door slammed, cut off his threats, but his face in the window remained twisted with hatred. Palace security had established a wider perimeter now, directing tourists away from the scene. Evidence markers dotted the courtyard where the knives had fallen, yellow plastic catching the last rays of sunlight. A forensics team was photographing blood drops on the ancient stones, none of it Lancaster's. 3 broken fingers, fractured rib, possible concussion, a paramedic reported from where she was treating one of Rico's associates. Textbook military defensive techniques, no excessive force. She glanced at Lancaster with professional appreciation. Whoever trained him well. Detective Inspector Williams was already on his radio, updating headquarters. 4 in custody, multiple weapons recovered. Yes, sir. The guard didn't even break ceremony until they attacked. Handled it like a combat veteran. Because he is one, sir. Royal Marines. Rico's threats continued to echo from the police van, muffled but still audible. His face appeared in the window again, mouthing words of violence and revenge, but they seemed hollow now, stripped of power by precise military efficiency. Palace workers appeared with brushes and cleaning equipment, efficiently removing any trace of the incident from the courtyard stones. Within minutes, the only signs of combat were the evidence markers waiting for forensics and the slight marks on Lancaster's otherwise immaculate uniform. "We'll need the CCTV footage," Williams instructed a palace security officer. "All angles, though from the witnesses' statements it's clear-cut. Attempted assault on a royal guard, possession of offensive weapons, criminal conspiracy." The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Lancaster remained at his post, his bearing straight, his dignity intact. The ceremonial rifle had been examined by forensics and returned. the wooden stock now bearing slight scuff marks where it had connected with Rico's wrist, preventing what could have been a fatal knife attack. "You can't arrest all of us," Rico's voice carried from the van one final time as it prepared to depart. "We'll keep coming. Keep showing you what real power looks like. Keep—" The van's engine drowned out his continued threats as it pulled away, taking its cargo of hatred and violence to face justice. Detective Inspector Williams made some final notes in his pocketbook. "Remarkable restraint," he commented quietly, though Lancaster gave no sign of hearing. "Could have easily killed them all. Chose to disarm and disable instead." He shook his head with professional admiration. "Ceremony backed by substance. Don't see that often these days." The guard captain approached Lancaster's position, his bearing equally precise. His eyes took in the barely perceptible signs of combat on Lancaster's uniform, the slightly displaced sash, the marked gloves, the faint scuff on his ceremonial rifle's stock. But it was the unwavering stance, the continued dedication to duty after violence, that drew a subtle nod of approval. "Guard Lancaster," the captain's voice carried the quiet authority of command. "Your relief is ready. Hold your post for inspection." Lancaster's response was parade ground perfect, his movements showing no sign of the combat that had occurred mere hours ago. His rifle snapped to inspection position with ceremonial precision, despite having been used as a defensive weapon earlier. The captain's inspection was thorough, professional. His white-gloved hands checked every button, every strap, every medal. When he reached the marked gloves and scuffed rifle stock, he paused momentarily. "Marks of duty," he noted quietly, "earned in service." Behind them, police photographers captured their final evidence images. The palace stones had been cleaned, returning to their pristine state. Like the guard who stood watch over them, they bore their scars invisibly, with dignity. In the distance, a police siren wailed briefly as the last transport van departed, carrying Rico's associates to face justice. Their threats had faded, replaced by the quiet discipline of centuries-old tradition. The same discipline that had turned ceremonial guards into combat-ready defenders when duty demanded. The sun's final light caught Lancaster's brass buttons as he prepared to relinquish his post. Each gleaming button reflected not just ceremony, but the readiness that lay beneath. The combat veteran who stood ready behind the ceremonial guard. "Post relieved," the captain commanded. "Guard Lancaster dismissed." Lancaster's final salute was perfect, his movement precise. As he marched away with his relief, his bearing showed no trace of the afternoon's violence. Just as it showed no trace of his Afghanistan tours, his combat medals, or the readiness that had turned ceremony into effective defence. The new guard took his position, rifle at the exact angle tradition demanded. The courtyard was quiet now, the last tourists of the day watching from appropriate distances. The changing of the guard had continued, uninterrupted by violence or threats. Above the palace, the Union Jack flew steadily in the evening breeze. Like the guards below, it stood as a symbol, not just of ceremony or tradition, but of the strength and readiness that lay beneath. A reminder that some uniforms are earned through more than just parade ground practice. The last light faded from the courtyard as Lancaster disappeared into the guardhouse. His ceremonial duty was done for the day, but the soldier beneath remained, ready, as always, to defend more than just ceremony when duty called. What would you have done in Guard Lancaster's position? When duty and danger collide, it's our training and discipline that determine how we respond. Perhaps that's the real lesson from today's events, that true strength lies not just in the uniform we wear, but in the preparation and dedication beneath it. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's training suddenly revealed itself in a critical situation? A time when what appeared to be ceremony proved to be something much more substantial. And ask yourself, How many times do we pass by these guards, seeing only the ceremony, forgetting the soldiers who stand ready beneath those ceremonial uniforms? Each one with their own story of service, their own battle-earned skills, their own unwavering dedication to duty. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us share these important reminders about the true meaning of service and duty with a wider audience. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We bring you powerful stories of duty, honor, and the unexpected moments when ceremony meets reality. Click that bell icon to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Watch our recent video about a disrespectful tourist who learned a similar lesson about judging uniforms by their ceremony alone. It's appearing in the top right corner of your screen right now. And remember, tradition endures not because it's unchanging, but because it's built on the solid foundation of those who stand ready to defend it, even when that defense requires more than just ceremony. Until next time, stay alert, stay respectful, and remember, sometimes the most important guard duty isn't the one you can see.